Hello again. We are nearing the end of our study of the Hebrew feasts. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot to study yet. We still want to study the Feast of Dedication, which is not mentioned in Leviticus 23. We need to deal also with Colossians chapter 2, as well as study some reasons why I don't believe that at this time we are required to keep the Hebrew feasts. And also we want to take some time to study about the so-called lunisolar Sabbath. Many people these days are keeping the Sabbath according to the moon rather than according to the solar calendar. So we have a lot to study yet, but this is the study of the last feast that is mentioned in Leviticus 23, the Feast of Tabernacles. And we will begin by reading from Leviticus chapter 23 and verses 33 to 36. Leviticus 23, verses 33 to 36. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it." That is a description of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we need to deal with some introductory matters before we actually study this feast. The Day of Atonement is the last date that we can know in the feast system. In other words, after the Day of Atonement, we do not have a date for the Feast of Tabernacles. The reason why is because in Revelation chapter 10, verse 6, the angel, who is Jesus Christ, by the way, said that time would be no longer. In other words, prophetic time came to an end in 1844. So we cannot know the specific date for the fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. However, we can be certain that it will occur at the very season of the year when the type occurred. The Feast of Tabernacles lasted 7 days, and then a glorious 8th day was added to the celebration. And I just throw this out here. This is my thought. Is it just possible that the feast will be fulfilled on the 7-day journey to heaven, and on the 8th day, when we actually arrive in heaven, we will enjoy the great day of the feast? It's a possibility. It's important for us to remember that the year-day principle applies only to the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. Are you following me or not? The year-day principle applies only to the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, because they occur during the dispensation of the Spirit when things are to be spiritually understood. The time periods during the church age, so to speak, are to be understood symbolically. 1260 days, time times the dividing of time, 42 months, etc., are to be understood in a symbolic sense. We do not apply the year-day principle to the Passover, to unleavened bread, to first fruits, or to Pentecost, because these were fulfilled before the Hebrew theocracy came to an end. The time element of the Feast of Tabernacles will once again, I believe, be literal, because Jesus will be literally present, and time periods will once again be literal. And by the way, this is the reason why the 1,000 years of Revelation are literal, because we will be literally present with the Lord. Are you understanding the principle? Now, in the series that I did in our first Anker School of Theology, which was Prophetic Principles, How to Study Bible Prophecy, I dedicated an extensive period of time to this specific principle. We can't dedicate time to that right now, so I just presented this one paragraph. Now, the first thing we want to do is to study the type. In other words, the Feast of Tabernacles as it was celebrated by the Jews. And then we are going to look at the antitype, how the Feast of Tabernacles applies to us and how we are to observe it. The first thing that I want us to notice is that the Israelites, during their wilderness wanderings, dwelt in tents. They had no permanent homeland at this time. They were actually always on the road. They were always on the move in provisional dwellings. Let's read from the book of Numbers, chapter 9, and verses 17 to 23, where we have a description of their nomadic life. It says, whenever the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle, after that the children of Israel would what? Would journey. And in the place where the cloud settled, there the children of Israel would pitch their tents. So they lived in tents. They did not live in permanent buildings. At the command of the Lord, the children of Israel would journey. And at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud stayed above the tabernacle, they remained encamped. Even when the cloud continued long, many days above the tabernacle, the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not journey. So it was when the cloud was above the tabernacle a few days, according to the command of the Lord, they would remain encamped. And according to the command of the Lord, they would journey. So it was when the cloud remained only from evening until morning. When the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they would journey. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud was taken up, they would journey. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year that the cloud remained above the tabernacle, the children of Israel remained camped and not journey. But when it was taken up, they would journey. At the command of the Lord, they remained encamped. And at the command of the Lord, they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. So basically, they led a nomadic life. They were always on the move. They had no permanent home while they were in their wilderness sojourn. They were strangers and pilgrims in the land, in other words. Let's notice Hebrews 11, verses 9 and 10, and then verses 13 through 16, where we find a description of the fact that they had no permanent homeland when they were in the before they actually settled in the promised land. It says there, by faith, he, that is Abraham, dwelt in the land of promise as in a what? As in a foreign country. Dwelling in what? Dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were what? Strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a what? A homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So basically, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they lived in tents. And the children of Israel also lived in the land, in the wilderness. When they were going to the land, they also lived in provisional dwellings. By the way, this explains the reason why at the Feast of Booths, they were in booths. They actually made homes out of, some had tents, some made homes out of, provisional homes out of branches of trees and so on, because they were commemorating the fact that during their sojourn, they had no settled home. They were always on the move. Now, it's important to recognize that at the Feast of Tabernacles, all males were supposed to be present. And of course, that would most likely include their families as well, because they weren't going to travel by themselves. Notice what we find here in the book of Exodus, chapter 23 and 14 through 17. There were 3 festivals where all of the males, 12 years and older, had to be there. The 3 harvest festivals. Passover, unleavened bread. Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. It says there, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of Abib. That's the same as Nisan. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. And then you have the next feast, and the Feast of Harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in the field. And then the third, and the Feast of Ingathering, that's the Feast of Tabernacles, at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times in the year, all your males shall appear before the Lord God. And of course, when the males appeared, also their families went with them, because they were heads of household. Ellen White amplifies this in Desire of Ages, page 448, where she writes, the feast continued for 7 days, and for its celebration, the inhabitants of Palestine, with many from other lands, left their homes, that is, they left their permanent homes, and came to Jerusalem. From far and near, the people came, bringing in their hands a token of rejoicing. Old and young, rich and poor, all brought some gift as a tribute of thanksgiving to him who had crowned the year with his goodness and made his paths drop fatness. Everything that could please the eye and give expression to the universal joy was brought from the woods. The city bore the appearance of a beautiful forest, because they built these provisional dwelling places during the Feast of Booths, 7 days, and then they added an 8th day. And all Israelites, basically, the heads of household with their families, were supposed to appear there for the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles was a season to thank God for his goodness, for the way God had been good with them in their wanderings through the wilderness, where they had had temporary dwellings. You see, God had given Israel water from the rock. He had given them manna from heaven. He had led them by a pillar of cloud and by a pillar of fire. Their shoes and their clothing had not worn for 40 years. Can you imagine having a suit for 40 years and not having it, and having it as new as it was before 40 years later? And their shoes did not wear. God certainly was good to them during their wilderness wanderings. And of course, the purpose of the Feast of Booths was to give thanks to God. It was a season of thankfulness to God for the way in which he had been with them in their wilderness sojourns. In fact, we find in Desire of Ages, page 448, these words. This feast was not only the harvest thanksgiving, but the memorial of God's protecting care over Israel in the wilderness. In commemoration of their tent life, the Israelites during the feast dwelt in booths or tabernacles of green boughs. These were erected in the streets, in the courts of the temple, or on the housetops. The hills and valleys surrounding Jerusalem were also dotted with these leafy dwellings and seemed to be alive with people. So the Feast of Tabernacles was a celebration of how God had blessed them and brought them to this point, brought them to the Promised Land, and how he had blessed them during their sojourn through the wilderness. Incidentally, by this time, their enemies had been subdued. Did they have to overcome enemies to finally settle in the Promised Land? Of course they did. God fought for them, didn't he? And finally, when they conquered the Promised Land, they had relief from their what? They had relief from their enemies. And that's an important point when we come to the book of Revelation. We'll deal with that later. The enemies had been subdued, and now they had rest. The word rest, many times in the Old Testament, is speaking about when they settled in Canaan and their enemies had all been destroyed and expelled from the land. Now, this was a season of rejoicing, of great rejoicing. And the rejoicing was for 3 reasons. Number 1, God had blessed them in their wilderness wanderings. Number 2, their sins had just been blotted out on the Day of Atonement, just a few days previous to this. And in the third place, They were thankful because an abundant harvest of fruit had been brought in. The grapes, the olives, and the dates had been gathered in, and they were thanking God for the abundant harvest. So 3 reasons. Number 1, because God had blessed them in their wilderness wanderings. Number 2, their sins had been blotted out, and their enemies, by the way, had been destroyed. And now they wanted to thank the Lord for the abundant harvest. Ellen White describes the joy and the singing of this feast. In Desire of Ages, page 448, she wrote, with sacred song and thanksgiving, the worshipers celebrated this occasion. A little before the feast was the Day of Atonement, when, after confession of their sins, the people were declared to be at peace with heaven. Thus the way was prepared for what? For the rejoicing of the feast. So was the Day of Atonement a day of rejoicing? The Day of Atonement, was that a day of rejoicing? No, the Day of Atonement was not a day of rejoicing. The Day of Atonement was a day of what? Was a day of affliction. So is now a time to rejoice? Are we supposed to be now in the Feast of Tabernacles rejoicing and thanking the Lord because we're finally in our permanent home? Of course not. No. Now we're in the feast of affliction. But the time is coming when we will celebrate the feast of rejoicing. So she says, thus the way was prepared for the rejoicing of the feast. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. She's quoting Psalm 106, verse 1. Rose triumphantly with all kinds of what? Of music, mingled with shouts of Hosanna, accompanied the united singing. So there's a lot of singing going on during this feast. The temple was the center of the universal what? See, at the center is the temple of universal joy. Here was the pomp of the sacrificial ceremonies. Here, ranged on either side of the white marble steps of the sacred building, the choir of the Levites led the service of song. The multitude of worshipers, waving their branches of palm and myrtle, took up the strain and echoed the chorus. And again the melody was caught up by voices near and afar off, till the encircling hills were vocal with praise. You can almost feel it, can't you? The celebration and the joy and the praise because God had ended their sojourn. He had blessed them in their wanderings. Their sins had been blotted out. Their enemies had been destroyed. And the fruit harvest had been gathered in. It was an occasion of great celebration. During this feast, there was a tremendous emphasis on water. There was a water ceremony that took place. Ellen White, in Desire of Ages, page 449, describes one of these ceremonies during the Feast of Tabernacles. Speaking about the priest, she says, he bore the flagon to the altar, which occupied a central position in the court of the priests. Here were 2 silver basins, with a priest standing at each one. The flagon of water was poured into one, and a flagon of wine into the other. And the contents of both flowed into a pipe which communicated with the Kedron. The Kedron was the brook that ran in the valley there, and was conducted to the Dead Sea. So you see, the water and the blood goes to the Dead Sea. And the symbolism is that the Dead Sea is now getting life. It's made what? Alive. And so she continues writing, this display of the consecrated water represented the fountain that at the command of God had gushed from the rock to quench the thirst of the children of Israel. Then the jubilant strains rang forth, the Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. Therefore, with joy shall ye draw water out of the wells of salvation. So there was an emphasis on water, a water ceremony during the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the reason why Jesus, on the great day of the feast, we read this before, in John chapter 7, 37 to 39, refers to water. He says, come to me and drink. Notice, on the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, Out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. But this he spoke concerning the Spirit, whom those believing in him would receive. For the Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. So at the Feast of Tabernacles, the last and great day, Jesus is saying, if you're thirsty, come to me and what? Drink. An emphasis on water in the Feast of Tabernacles. But there was also a great emphasis on light at the Feast of Tabernacles. In John chapter 7, and also chapter 8, verse 12, and chapter 9 and verse 5, we find these words. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. So these words that Jesus is going to speak are being spoken at the Feast of Tabernacles. It says, then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am what? I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And then in John 9, verse 5, he says once again, as long as I am in the world, I am what? I am the light of the world. He's speaking these words at the Feast of Tabernacles. There's tremendous emphasis on light, water and light. Remember these details. We're going to come back to them. Ellen White in Desire of Ages 463 speaks about the light aspect of the Feast of Tabernacles. I read now from that page. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. When he spoke these words, Jesus was in the court of the temple, especially connected with the services of what? Of the Feast of Tabernacles. In the center of this court rose two lofty standards, supporting lampstands of great size. After the evening sacrifice, all the lamps were kindled, shedding their light over Jerusalem. So the whole city is what? Is lighted. That's important. This ceremony was in commemoration of the pillar of light that guided Israel in the desert, and was also regarded as pointed forward to the coming of whom? Of the Messiah. At evening, when the lamps were lighted, the court was a scene of great rejoicing. Gray-haired men, the priests of the temple, and the rulers of the people, united in the festive dances to the sound of instrumental music and the chants of the Levites. In the illumination of Jerusalem, the people expressed their hope of the Messiah's coming to shed his light upon Israel. But to Jesus, the scene had a wider meaning. As the radiant lamps of the temple lighted up all about them, so Christ, the source of spiritual light, illumines the darkness of the world. Yet the symbol was imperfect. That great light, which his own hand had set in the heavens, was a truer representation of the glory of his mission. In other words, the sun was a better representation of Christ as light than the two lamps that were there in the courtyard of the temple. Another important point is that at the Feast of Tabernacles, offerings were made. Does that mean that during the final Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus is going to be sacrificed all over again? Of course not. It must have a different symbolism. But there must be some sense in which Jesus Christ, in the future, attention will be brought to his what? To his sacrifice. Another interesting detail is that during the Feast of Tabernacles, there was great emphasis on the law of God. In Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 14 through 18, we find these words. This is in the days of Nehemiah when they're celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. And they found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, and that they should announce and proclaim in all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, Go out to the mountain and bring olive branches, branches of oil trees, myrtle branches, remember now, palm branches, and branches of the leafy trees to make booths, as it is written. Then the people went out, brought them, and made themselves booths, each one on the roof of his house, or in the courtyards, or the courts of the house of God, and in the open square of the water gate, and in the open square of the gate of Ephraim. So the whole assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and sat under the booths. Are they returning now from the sojourn, from being away from their permanent home? Yeah, they're returning from captivity now. And so verse 17, so the whole assembly of those who had returned from captivity made booths and sat under the booths. For since the days of Joshua the son of Nun, until that day the children of Israel had not done so, and there was very great what? Gladness, because now they were settled in their land again. Also day by day, from the first day until the last, he read what? He read from the book of the law of God. And they kept the feast 7 days. And on the 8th day, there was a sacred assembly according to the prescribed manner. So there's a reading of the book of the law at the Feast of Tabernacles. Another interesting detail is that only native Israelites could participate in the Feast of Tabernacles. It says in Leviticus 23, 42 and 43, you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites, that is members of God's people, right? True members of God's people. By the way, when had it been shown that they were members of God's people? On the Day of Atonement that had just taken place. He continues saying, you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do you remember that some Israelites were cut off on the Day of Atonement, those who did not sympathize? So would they have been present there for the Feast of Tabernacles? Absolutely not. Another interesting thing is that the temple that was built by Solomon was dedicated at the Feast of Tabernacles. So there's emphasis on the dedication of the temple at the Feast of Tabernacles. We find in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 1 and verses 8 through 11 the following words. When Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. At that time, Solomon kept what? The feast 7 days, and all Israel with him. A very great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. And on the 8th day, they held a sacred assembly. On the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away to their tents, joyful and glad of heart, for the good that the Lord had done for David, for Solomon, and for his people Israel. Thus Solomon finished the temple of the Lord and the king's house, and Solomon successfully accomplished all that came into his heart to make in the house of the Lord and in his own house. And now God had a permanent temple to dwell in. So this is the Feast of Tabernacles. Are you clear on all the details? You know, we've gone through all of the general aspects of it. You know, we could zero in on all of the little itsy-bitsy details too, but we just don't have the time. So let's deal now with the antitype of the Feast of Tabernacles. There is a present spiritual dimension to the Feast of Tabernacles. Can we drink the water of life now, spiritually speaking? Yes. Can we eat the manna now, spiritually speaking? Yes. Can we receive light from the light of the world now? Yes, we can. Can we catch a vision of our permanent home now, from afar? Yes. Can we sing the songs of Canaan now? We certainly can. But the fullest and literal fulfillment of the feast is still when? In the future. When our pilgrimage on earth is over, we will travel for 7 days to heaven, obviously dwelling in temporary dwellings, and dwell in provisional places on our journey. And on the 8th day, we shall celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in heaven, which will last for 1,000 years, and then we will return to our permanent home, the earth made new. What kind of place are we living in now? Is this earth now our permanent home? No. We are living in tents, so to speak. Notice Hebrews 11, 13 and 14. It says these, that is in the Old Testament, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were what? Strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Are we strangers and pilgrims on the earth as well? Of course we are. So what were they looking for? For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. What is that homeland? The homeland is the new earth. The homeland is the new earth. The meek shall inherit the earth. Heaven will be our temporary abode. But the new earth will be our permanent home. Now, are all of God's people going to travel to the New Jerusalem? Remember that all of the males with their families had to travel to Jerusalem? Are all of God's people going to travel to Jerusalem? Yeah, which Jerusalem? The New Jerusalem. That's right. John 14, 1-3, Jesus made the promise. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. Where's the Father's house? In heaven. If it were not so, I would have told you. Actually, some versions translate many rooms. But those many rooms, that's not our permanent home. Our permanent home is going to be on the earth because we plant vineyards, etc. And so it says here, Jesus says, if it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. It's interesting that in early writings, page 16, Ellen White tells us how long the trip to heaven is going to take. She stated, we all entered the cloud together and were, for how long? Are we going to be living in permanent homes on the way there? No. For 7 days ascending to the sea of glass, when Jesus brought the crowns and with his own right hand placed them on our heads, he gave us harps of gold and palms of victory. That most likely took place on the great day of the feast, so to speak. Now, is there going to be a lot of heavenly celebration and praise during the time that God's people spend in heaven? Absolutely. Let's notice Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes. What do they have in their hands? Remember the palm branches at the Feast of Tabernacles? With palm branches in their hands. This must be the celebration of Tabernacles. And crying out with a loud voice, saying what? Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So they're singing. Revelation 19 adds to the picture. It says in verse 1, and I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, as the sound of many waters, and as the sound of mighty thunderings, saying, Hallelujah. This verse is actually verses 7 and 8. Hallelujah. For the Lord God omnipotent reigns. Let us be what? Be glad and rejoice and give him glory. For the marriage of the Lamb has come. Actually, it's the marriage supper of the Lamb. Where is that marriage supper going to take place? It's going to take place in heaven. It says, and his wife has made herself ready. So, at the Feast of Tabernacles, there was great singing and there was happiness and there was joy. Because their pilgrimage was what? Was over. And because their sins had been taken care of on the Day of Atonement. And because the harvest of fruit had been what? Had been gathered in. Notice this rather long passage from Ellen White where she describes the rejoicing at the Feast of Tabernacles. The people of Israel praised God at the Feast of Tabernacles as they called to mind his mercy in their deliverance from the bondage of Egypt and his tender care for them during their pilgrim life in the wilderness. They rejoiced also, notice they're rejoicing because God had been with them. They rejoiced also in the consciousness of pardon and acceptance through the service of the Day of Atonement just ended. Are God's people in heaven going to rejoice about that too? Sure. Are we going to rejoice that our earthly pilgrimage is over, living in temporary abodes? Most certainly. She continues saying, but when the ransomed of the Lord shall have been safely gathered into the heavenly Canaan, forever delivered from the bondage of the curse, under which the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now, they will rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. Christ's great work of atonement for men will then have been completed, and their sins will have been forever what? Blotted out. And now it says, the wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert, and the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. Notice once again the emphasis on what? On water. And a highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for the wayfaring men, though fools shall not err therein. No lion shall be there, nor any ravenous beast shall go up thereon. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall what? Shall flee away. Okay, can you catch what this is going to be about? It's going to be a great celebration with singing, with rejoicing, with joining the heavenly choirs in the singing. Now, heaven is not our permanent home, is it? It's just a tabernacle. It's interesting in Revelation 21 verse 3. It says, and I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. See, at this point, it's not talking about the settling in the new earth. It's talking about something that is going to happen in the future, because the verbs are future. Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. They shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. I find it interesting that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 4, even our present body is called a tent. The Apostle Paul says we now live in a tent. But then when we get our resurrection body, we will have a building, a permanent building, our permanent body. So even our sojourn here, our body is spoken of as a tent. But when we get there, we will have our permanent building. And of course, heaven is not our permanent home. Heaven is only a place where we will camp out to celebrate the final day of the Feast of Tabernacles, to then come to this world, because the Bible says that the meek will inherit what? The earth. Let me ask you, in the New Jerusalem, is there a big emphasis on water? You remember water at the Feast of Tabernacles? Notice Revelation 21 verse 6, 22 verse 1, and verse 17, and chapter 7 and verses 16 and 17. Time and again you have emphasis on water in the fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'm reading these verses. It says, and he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of what? Of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. See, there's an emphasis on water. And he showed me, once again, what? A pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And then here is another verse. And the Spirit and the bride say, come. And let him who hears say, come. And let him who what? Who thirsts come. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life freely. Is this the Feast of Tabernacles that we're talking about here? Obviously. They shall neither hunger anymore, nor what? Nor thirst anymore. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to where? To living fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. By the way, this is not only spiritually speaking about water. We're going to really drink the water of life from a real river. Because there is a real river up there. Then it will be literal. See? Now in this life, we eat from the tree of life spiritually. We eat the manna spiritually. We drink the water spiritually. But when we get there, it will be what? It will be literal. So we have this emphasis on the water in the Feast of Tabernacles. And also in the future when the Feast of Tabernacles is fulfilled. Now, this reminded me of the song. You remember the ceremony where you have one flagon with water and the other one with grape juice, and they're poured together. They go through the tube to the Kedron and then to the Dead Sea. You remember when Jesus died on the cross, what came out? Water mixed with blood. And so you have this song, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the what? And the blood from thy riven side which flowed be of sin the double cure, cleanse me from its guilt and its also what? And its power. So there's emphasis on water. And we will drink from the water. Literally we'll drink from the water. But of course, spiritually, it represents the Spirit that was given to us during our earthly sojourn. Is there a great emphasis on light in the holy city, where we will dwell temporarily? Absolutely. Notice Revelation chapter 21 and verse 23. The city had no need of the sun or of the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God illuminated it. The Lamb is its light, and the nations of those who are saved shall walk in its light. This is chapter 22 and verse 5. And the kings of the earth bring their glory and honor to it. There shall be no night there. They need no lamp nor light of the sun, for the Lord God gives them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. So once again, at the Feast of Tabernacles in the New Jerusalem, we will not need the light of the sun or the moon, because the glory of the Lord will be so great that it will be like the sun and the moon don't exist, although they are there. You remember that on the day at the Feast of Tabernacles, people commemorated not only the water that came from the rock and also the pillar of light, because this is what it represents. You know, the pillar of light had led them, and they had drunk water from the rock, but also God gave them manna. Are God's people going to eat manna at the Feast of Tabernacles in heaven? Absolutely. Notice Revelation chapter 2 and verse 17. Revelation 2 and verse 17. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the what? Some of the hidden manna to eat. Are God's people going to serve in the temple? Is there going to be a temple there? Absolutely. Revelation 7:14 to 17 tells us so. Remember that the temple was dedicated in the days of Solomon? It says here, so he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night where? In his temple. And he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. The word dwell could be translated will tabernacle among them. The NIV translates will spread his tent over them, because this is the Feast of Tents or the Feast of Tabernacles. And then it says, they shall neither hunger anymore nor thirst anymore. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So there will be a temple, and God's people will serve according to this in that temple. Was there a temple that was built and dedicated at the Feast of Tabernacles in the days of Solomon? There was a focus on the temple. You remember that there were burnt offerings at the Feast of Tabernacles? What does that represent? The fact is that if you read Revelation 5, 12, and 13, and also you have the references here, Revelation 21, verse 9, verse 14, verse 22, verse 23, chapter 23, verses 1 and 3, and other verses as well, Jesus is referred to as the Lamb, the Lamb, the Lamb. Notice this comment from Ellen White. One reminder alone remains. Our Redeemer will ever bear the marks of his crucifixion. Upon his wounded head, upon his side, his hands and feet are the only traces of the cruel work that sin has wrought. That's Great Controversy, page 674. So will the attention of God's people be drawn to Jesus Christ as the Lamb who made it all possible? Absolutely. So is there going to be another sacrifice on the day of Feast of Tabernacles? Of course not. It simply represents the fact that people will remember the great sacrifice that Jesus made in coming to this world. Now, you notice that there's a great celebration with singing and rejoicing, and there's a banquet that takes place. Notice Luke chapter 13 and verse 29. This is speaking once again about the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall come from the east, and from the west, and from the north, and from the south, and shall sit down in the kingdom of God. Luke 22 and verse 30 states, and here Jesus speaks, that you may eat and drink where? At my table, in my kingdom, and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, judging there represents a work that is taking place when? During the 1,000 years. And then Revelation 19, 7 and 8, then he said to me, write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Where is the marriage supper going to take place? On earth or in heaven? In heaven, yes, the Feast of Tabernacles. And he said to me, these are the true sayings. And Ellen White saw in a vision that table. What kind of products do you suppose are on the table? Well, what has just taken place? The fruit harvest, right, has just taken place. Notice what she says in Early Writings, page 19. And I saw a table of pure silver. It was many miles in length. So I guess he's expecting lots of guests. Yet our eyes could extend over it. I saw the fruit of the tree of life. Fresno people will be very happy with what I'm going to read right now. The manna. What else? Almonds. What else? Figs. What else? Pomegranates. And what else? Grapes. And many other kinds of fruit. So don't feel bad if mangoes and papayas are not here. Ellen White mentions the fall harvests in Israel because it's the Feast of Tabernacles, but she leaves it open for other kinds of fruit. Maybe she didn't know what to call a mango. I don't know that she knew what mangoes were or papayas were. But take comfort. There were probably tropical fruits there as well. Do you remember that only Israelites could partake of the Feast of Tabernacles? Who will be the only ones that will be able to participate of the final Feast of Tabernacles? Only those whose names have been retained in the book during the Day of Atonement. Notice Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. 144,000 will live during this period, folks. Even to that time, and at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that is found written where? In the book. When were their names retained in the book? Before they go through this time of trouble. When were they retained? When their name came forth in the judgment during the Day of Atonement. We find in Revelation 3 verse 5, he who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life. So is it possible to have names blotted out? Sure. Can people be cut off from among God's people in the Day of Atonement? Absolutely. I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Exodus 32 has the story of Moses interceding for Israel when they sinned. And the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will what? I will blot him out of my book. In other words, a person who continues in sin will be blotted out of the book, will be cut off from among God's people. And of course, we're reminded of Leviticus 23, 29, and 30, where it says, for any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be what? Shall be cut off from his people. Now, I'm going to skip the next paragraph. You can read it because it covers far more than what we're able to cover in the minutes that we have left. But I do want to go to this section that is titled, Why Are We Still Here? Why are we still in our wilderness sojourn and not there? I want to read several statements of Ellen White in closing. Evangelism, page 696. We may have to remain here in this world because of insubordination many more years, as did the children of Israel. But for Christ's sake, His people should not add sin to sin by charging God with the consequence of their own wrong course of action. We say, why does God delay? Why don't you come, Lord? Like we're blaming Him. We should not blame Him. The blame lies with us. Manuscript 4, 1883. Ellen White wrote, it was not the will of God that the coming of Christ should be thus delayed. God did not design that His people Israel should wander 40 years in the wilderness. He knew they were going to, but He didn't design it that way. He promised to lead them directly to the land of Canaan and establish them there, a holy, healthy, happy people. The idea was to get there quickly, wasn't it? But those to whom it was first preached went not in because of unbelief. She's quoting Hebrews chapter 3. Their hearts were filled with murmuring, rebellion, and hatred, and He could not fulfill His covenant with them. The flagon of water was poured. Oh, this is out of place here. She continues, just cross off those last 3 lines. Evidently it was cut and pasted in the wrong place. She does continue, for 40 years did unbelief, murmuring, and rebellion shut out ancient Israel from the land of Canaan. The same sins, notice this, the same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into where? Into the heavenly Canaan. In neither case were the promises of God at fault. It is the unbelief, the worldliness, unconsecration, and strife among the Lord's professed people that have kept us in this world of sin and sorrow so many years. You know, we should reach the point where we long for Jesus to come, like Ellen White did. You know, when she caught a glimpse of that table in heaven with all these different kinds of fruit, she didn't want to come back. She had seen heaven. So if we see heaven, we certainly don't want to make this earth our home. I want to read this passage from Early Writings, pages 19 and 20. Ellen White states, I asked Jesus to let me eat of the fruit. She wanted to eat of the fruit of the tree of life. He said, not now. Those who eat of the fruit of this land go back to earth no more. But in a little while, if faithful, you shall both eat of the fruit of the tree of life and drink of the water of the fountain. Notice once again, water. And He said, you must go back to the earth again and relate to others what I have revealed to you. Then an angel bore me gently down to this dark world. Sometimes I think I can stay here no longer. All things of earth look so dreary. I feel very lonely here, for I have seen a better land. Oh, that I had wings like a dove. Then I would fly away and be at rest. Can you hear the anguish? She really wanted Jesus to come. She continues writing, after I came out of vision, everything looked changed. A gloom was spread over all that I beheld. Oh, how dark this world looked to me. I wept when I found myself here and felt homesick. I had seen a better world, and it had spoiled this for me. I told the view to our little band in Portland, who then fully believed it to be of God. That was a powerful time. The solemnity of eternity rested upon us. After 1 week, after this, the Lord gave me another view and showed me the trials I must pass through. and that I must go and relate to others what he had revealed to me, and that I should meet with great opposition and suffer anguish of spirit by going. However, said the angel, the grace of God is sufficient for you. He will hold you up. Early Writings, pages 19 and 20. And of course, this is Ellen White's first vision. I don't think she had any idea the anguish that she was going to go through. Not primarily from those individuals that were not members of the remnant, but from those individuals who claimed to be members of the remnant. Constantly, during her ministry, her inspiration was questioned. Her counsel was questioned. She was attacked. Her visions were attributed to mesmerism, which is hypnotism. She was rejected many, many times. She became ill. I mean, she actually came to the point of almost dying several times. She suffered with rheumatoid arthritis during the time that she was writing Desire of Ages. Certainly, she desired heaven to come. And she fulfilled her mission. 70 years she fulfilled her mission. And we have the benefit of her writings. And I believe that one of the reasons why we are not in the kingdom is because we have ignored and in some cases rejected this wonderful gift and failed to implement the counsel that she gave into our own personal and practical life. That's what God is waiting for. Ellen White rests in the grave. She will rise to new life very soon. And then she will once again see the better land. I pray to God that we will feel the same passion for heaven and for the new earth that Ellen White felt. That we will not focus on things here. That we will focus on the great celebration to come. The great celebration in heaven. And then our permanent dwelling here on earth. For the Bible tells us the meek will inherit the earth. Then we will eat manna. We will drink the water from the river of life. We will be in the presence of God who is light. And we will live not just for a few years and get sick, but we will live in a land where there will be no more sickness, no more pain, no more sorrow, no more death. May that hope burn bright and strong in our hearts.